the fall of 2016, I moved into an old, half-renovated house built in the 1880s near the original campus of a small university. The area around the old campus had turned into a park, but it was known for being filled with homeless people and those struggling with addiction. The house had been split into a strange duplex, and my friend, who had lived there before me, claimed it was haunted. I didn't believe him. He was a bit eccentric. The layout of the house was odd. When you entered, you found yourself in a living room-like space. Walking further, there was an open doorway leading to a bedroom, and beyond that was the kitchen. The only doors in the entire place were the ones to the bathroom and the shared basement. My first night there was uneventful, though I felt a bit uneasy since I hadn't lived alone in a long time. I stayed up late and eventually drifted off to sleep, but I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of drumming. It was like a group of people were pounding on every flat surface in the living room. The noise continued for a few minutes, and I was absolutely terrified. After finally gathering the courage to investigate, I walked into the living room, and the noise abruptly stopped. A few days later, a friend came over. As he was about to leave, we stood by the front door next to my bookshelf. I was telling him about my trouble sleeping and the strange experience from my first night. Just as I was speaking, a book flew off the shelf and landed 3 feet away. It had to pass by the dresser the shelf was perched on and landed right between us. My friend gave me a creeped out look and quickly made his exit, which I completely understood. Eventually, I asked the guy living in the other half of the duplex what was going on. He had lived there for 8 years and told me that no one else had stayed longer than a year. Everyone reported similar strange experiences, though nothing ever happened on his side of the house. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't ignore it. Strange noises continued every night, sometimes whispers from the walls, other times footsteps pacing outside my bedroom. I started feeling like I was being watched whenever I was alone in the house. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a loud banging coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was hammering the walls. Despite my fear, I went to investigate. As I descended the creaky stairs, the banging grew louder and more frantic. My heart pounded as I reached the bottom step and entered the dimly lit basement. To my surprise, the room was empty except for some old boxes and dusty furniture covered in sheets. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with that house. The dread continued to build, making it harder and harder to ignore. One evening, while cooking dinner, I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the bedroom. I dropped everything and ran to check it out, but when I got there, the room was empty. The only sound was my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I felt like I was losing my mind. The strange occurrences became more frequent, and I was convinced that something beyond my understanding was tormenting me. But I couldn't afford to move. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own home. Then one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was jolted awake from a fitful sleep by whispering coming from the walls. It was like 100 voices speaking at once, their words filled with malice and hatred. A chill ran down my spine as I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and I heard a low, guttural growl from the foot of my bed. I turned on the bedside lamp, expecting to see some kind of wild animal, but what I saw was far worse. Standing at the foot of my bed was a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and a twisted grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I wanted to scream or run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. Then with a sudden burst of speed, the figure lunged at me, its clawed hands reaching out. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, and I was alone in the darkness once more. I knew I had to leave that house, no matter what. I packed my bags and fled into the night, leaving behind the nightmares that haunted me in that cursed place. To this day, I still don't know what was lurking in the shadows of that old house, and I pray I never find out. But one thing is certain: I will never forget the horrors I witnessed there, and I will never set foot in that house again. When I was about 13, I spent the night at my cousin's house. It was a small, cozy place hidden away in the countryside, surrounded by tall trees and darkness. My cousin and I were home alone because his parents were out of town. We were excited about staying up late, playing video games until the early morning hours. As the night grew darker, we huddled together in his room, with the glow of the TV casting eerie shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the clicking of buttons and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I was so absorbed in the game, sitting on the edge of the bed, when my cousin got up to use the restroom. I barely noticed he was gone, too focused on the game. But then, I felt something behind me, a presence in the room that shouldn't have been there. Without thinking, I turned to talk to my cousin, but he wasn't there. Confused, I looked around the empty room. That's when I noticed it. The faint impression on the bed where someone had been sitting just moments before. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I realized I wasn't alone. I called out to my cousin, but there was no answer. Fear began to creep into my mind as I considered the possibility of something sinister hiding in the darkness. I was too scared to check under the bed or in the closet, fearing what I might find. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Hours passed, and my cousin still hadn't returned from the restroom. Anxiety gnawed at me as I debated whether to leave the safety of the room to look for him. Eventually, my concern got the better of me, and I ventured out into the dimly lit hallway. The house seemed different at night, stranger, more threatening. Shadows danced along the walls, and every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down my spine. I called out to my cousin again, but there was no response. I made my way to the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was closed, and I hesitated before softly knocking. "Cousin?" I whispered, hoping for a reply. Silence greeted me, and a sense of dread washed over me. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door, bracing myself for what I might find. But the bathroom was empty, no sign of my cousin anywhere. Panic surged through me as I realized he was gone, vanished without a trace. Frantically, I searched the rest of the house, calling out his name into the darkness, but there was no response. As the minutes turned into hours, I began to fear the worst. What if something had happened to him? What if there was someone or something else in the house with us? With each passing moment, my fear grew until it felt like it would consume me entirely. I was on the verge of tears when I heard it, a whisper echoing through the darkness. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible above the sound of my pounding heart, but it sent chills down my spine, filling me with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever felt before. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. It led me to the basement, a place I had always found unsettling, even in daylight. As I descended the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me like a thick fog. I hesitated at the bottom, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any sign of life. Then I heard it, the sound of someone crying. It was coming from the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. And then I saw him, my cousin, huddled in the corner, his face streaked with tears. Relief washed over me as I rushed to his side, wrapping my arms around him in a tight embrace. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. My cousin looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," he whispered. "I was in the restroom, and then something grabbed me, something cold and inhuman." A chill ran down my spine as I listened to his words. Whatever had happened to him, it was something beyond my understanding, something dark and malevolent. Together, we made our way back upstairs, our hearts still racing with fear. We locked ourselves in his room, too afraid to venture out into the unknown. As the night wore on, we huddled together, clinging to each other for comfort, knowing that whatever had happened to us, we would never be the same again. A few years ago, I was home alone while my husband was away on a work trip. Our small, quiet house felt eerily empty, and the wind outside was howling, making the windows rattle. The darkness seemed to creep into every corner. To keep myself busy, I decided to make dinner, letting the comforting smell of spices fill the kitchen. I turned on the news on our smart TV, placing the remote on the coffee table, then returned to the kitchen to continue cooking. After a few minutes of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, I noticed the sound from the TV had gone silent. Confused, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked into the living room. To my surprise, the TV screen showed a live video of our living room couch, but it wasn't just any couch, it was ours. I felt a wave of confusion and fear as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How could the TV be showing a live feed of our living room? Everything seemed undisturbed, and the remote was still where I had left it. A chill ran down my spine as I realized someone was watching me through our TV. Panic set in, but I knew I had to act quickly. With shaking hands, I grabbed a roll of tape and covered the camera on the TV, hoping to block whoever was spying on us. For days afterwards, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the lights made me jumpy. I couldn't stop wondering how long someone had been watching us before I noticed. Then one evening, a news report caught my attention. The headline made my heart skip a beat. Smart TVs vulnerable to hacking. My fear deepened as I listened to the report, explaining how hackers could access cameras on certain smart TVs remotely. It felt like a cold hand was gripping my heart. I glanced nervously at our TV, realizing it had been our window into the outside world and someone's window into ours. From that day on, I was always on edge, feeling like I was being watched. Every shadow in the house seemed to hide something, and every sound made me suspicious. I became hyper-aware, checking every corner of the house for signs of someone being there. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching sound. My heart raced as I listened closely, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The scratching got louder and more insistent, filling the whole house. Panic gripped me as I realized it was getting closer, inching toward me. I reached for the phone, ready to call for help, but before I could, the scratching stopped suddenly, leaving behind an eerie silence. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding, as I waited for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained quiet, as if it was holding its breath. Then just as suddenly, the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from the living room, from the very TV that had been our gateway to the outside world. With a sinking feeling, I realized that the source of the scratching wasn't some intruder. It was something far worse. Something had been lurking in our home all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. As the scratching grew louder and more frantic, I knew that whatever was on the other side of that TV wasn't human. It was something dark, something malevolent. And as I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I knew our nightmare was far from over. In the darkness of the night, with no one to hear our cries for help, we were at the mercy of whatever lurked on the other side of that TV screen.